I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. It's the third week of January, and I guess I can't lie to myself anymore. It's indeed a new year. It's true, and I guess I have to look towards the future instead of trying to fit in just a few more books from 2023 that I really wanted to check out. Appropriately, on this week's episode, two of my colleagues from the Book Review, Tina Jordan and Joumana Khatib, joined me to talk about some of the books we're most excited about from the first 3 or 4 months of this year. Tina, thanks for being on.
Thanks for having me.
Joumana, welcome.
Happy New Year.
So let's jump right into it. The first book I want to talk about is really a major book. No one has seen it. No one will probably see it until the very last minute. It comes out in mid-April, and it is Knife by Salman Rushdie. It is a memoir. Tina, take it away.
It's a memoir. The subtitle says it all, Meditations After an Attempted Murder. As you may remember, Rushdie was stabbed on stage at a summer arts institute in upstate New York in August 2022, right before he was set to give his talk. It was a knife attack. It left him blind in one eye. It affected nerves in his hands. I think there may be other damage that we don't know about and won't find out about until we read the book itself. And what was interesting to me is that at first he said he was not going to write a memoir about this attack, right? He told David Remnick of The New Yorker in an interview, look, the story's out there. I'm not going to tell it again. But he changed his mind, obviously.
You know, it didn't totally shock me that he changed his mind, though, Tina, because I feel like this is very keeping with Rushdie, right? I mean, of course, he wrote a memoir about the decade that he lived under the fatwa, Joseph Anton. So I'm happy that he's writing this, and I'm looking forward to it.
I am too, and I think it's interesting that he's writing as Salman Rushdie, right, this time around. He said in the press release for the book, and I thought this was interesting, this was a necessary book for me to write, a way to take charge of what happened and to answer violence with art. And I think we've all wondered over the years, like ever since the fatwa, how has that affected his art?
It's like Rushdie in a nutshell, his artistic work in a nutshell.
Right, exactly. Like maybe now we'll come away with a sense of what the threatened violence and actual violence, like how he has processed that in his art. And I think that's what everybody is hoping for in the book. The book was announced last fall. It's quite slim. I noticed that on Amazon, it's listed as 224 pages, which of course means it's substantially less than that, probably around 200 pages.
Is that a bad thing? Because we read a lot of big books here, and I am grateful for a 224-page book.
I am too. It's not a problem at all. I think the other interesting thing is that the trial of the attacker was delayed. It was meant to be starting about right now. The accused attacker and his lawyer successfully argued that they, in fact, needed to see the book and any related materials because it was evidence, frankly.
It also has an amazing cover, very simple, very striking. Listeners, just Google Salman Rushdie Knife book jacket. You'll see what we're talking
Right.
about here. It's an interactive podcast. So that is a big book by someone who's written a lot of books and is very well known. There's another book that many of us at the Book Review are looking forward to by someone who is not as well known, but has become a little bit more so in the past few months based on a film adaptation of one of his previous books. Joumana, would you tell us about James by Percival Everett?
Yes, happily. I love Percival Everett. He writes like a maniac. He writes like at a speed that I can't even comprehend. I don't know what's like, there must be something in the thyroid, whatever. It's great. So this is James. This is his retelling of Huck Finn from Jim's perspective. And if you've read Huck Finn, he's an enslaved person who knows Huck and kind of feels protective towards him. And of course, the two go up the river together and they have this kind of picaresque adventure. But this has also been a very contested figure in American literature. And so Percival Everett has totally turned the story around, told it from his perspective, endowed it with a lot of richness that I think was missing from the original. It's very exciting. It's a book about language and code switching, and it's a real joy to read. And just as a fun little Easter egg, I was reading Erasure over the weekend, which is, of course, the novel that the screenplay for American Fiction is based on. And the epigraph for that novel 20 years ago is from Mark Twain.
Interesting. Can I just say that I saw and loved American Fiction, and it made me realize how shockingly little Percival Everett I've read, which is bad, right? And so I rarely make New Year's resolutions about reading, but my New Year's resolution this year is to really work my way through his backlist. Like, I need to catch up.
What's amazing, because I'm with you, right? There's so much on the backlist that I haven't read, but every single book is a completely different iteration or expression of what's going on in his mind. It is totally exciting.
Let's do some live recommendations here. Joumana, what's another book that Tina should read by Percival Everett?
Dr. No, of course, or The Trees. And of course, Erasure. I mean, it may have been a while since you've read Erasure. It's incredibly good. So
those are two, as we call them here on our planning doc. There's some behind the scenes nomenclature, plain old big book releases. We're looking forward to both Knife by Salman Rushdie and James by Percival Everett. But we also have a couple of debut novels by people who have never written a big piece of fiction before. I'm going to talk about the first one. And this is a book called The Book of Love. This is by an author named Kelly Link. And you may know Kelly Link. She's a writer. She's been writing for quite a while. She's never published a novel. And she's known for her short stories. She's written fantastical fiction in the short story format for many, many years now. They're weird stories. They're surreal. You can come up with a million adjectives for how creepy and uncanny they are. Her last story collection, which was called White Cat, Black Dog, it came out last year. And she's finally here with her first novel, which is coming out right around Valentine's Day. And unlike the Rushdie, this is a big book. This is over 600 pages. You heard an audible gasp here. And this is a book about three teenagers who, a year after they've disappeared, come back from the dead. There's magic. There's the supernatural. It's all the things that you would expect from Kelly Link, if you're familiar with her at all, but at length. And I think I'm definitely going to tackle this one. She's a Pulitzer finalist. She is a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. She works in the fantastical and speculative fiction, but it's also with literary undertones. I think she's great. And if you do not, listeners, want to tackle a book this big at the outset, you really should just pick up one of her short story collections and pick a story at will. And if it's not too weird for you, then you will keep reading. And I think you will keep reading. Joumana, you have the next one here. Debut novel from someone who is also published in another format. Tell us about it.
Yes. So this is Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. Kaveh Akbar is a poet. His poems are in the New Yorker a lot. He's of Iranian descent, and he's a beautiful writer. And personally, I love reading novels by poets because if nothing else, I know that on the sentence level, the book is going to be a joy to read, right? Because they have that kind of sensitivity to language. And all that is there in this book. But there's a very propulsive plot and kind of unforgettable main character in this book that I love too. So our narrator is Cyrus Shams, born in Iran, came to the States, and he's trying to get sober. He's an addict. He's a struggling poet. His life is kind of in shambles when we first meet him. But there's this incredible kind of life force. He's funny. He's a little filthy. He's very insouciant. And so this becomes a bigger story about him coming to terms with some real inherited trauma. His mother died in a plane crash when he was an infant. His father has died when he was in college. There's a surreal episode between his mother and Lisa Simpson that I personally loved and would highly recommend that at least you make it to that point. And it's just like this totally wonderful and surprising and very thoughtful and affecting story about grief, about coming to terms with your demons. And the conceit is a little shocking because early on in the book, there's a scene where Cyrus is talking with his sponsor, right? And they're having a pretty charged conversation. And he's saying, I just want to die for something that matters. And his sponsor is saying, oh, you sound like you want to be a martyr. And he goes, yeah, that's exactly what I want to be. And it takes off from there.
Martyr is a book that I've been hearing about on the desk from other editors. A couple of editors have read it. They've been really big on it. big enough to argue for it being on the cover of the print book review. For those who still read print, the book is out January 22nd, so you'll be able to get it quite soon. Tina, you're going to tackle the next two. These are new books by longtime favorites. One is fiction, one is nonfiction.
Right.
Go in whatever order you want.
Well, let me go with the nonfiction first. That's Erik Larson's new book. It's called The Demon of Unrest, a saga of hubris, heartbreak, and heroism at the dawn of the Civil War. It's the story of what happened in between the very unlikely election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 and the Confederacy's shelling of Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April 1861, which is, of course, what kicked off the Civil War. That seems like a very short amount of time, but that, in fact, is Larson's specialty. He likes to mine the historical record, primary source material, for the tiniest of details, for instances in history which are just mere blips, right? He's a lot like David Grann. He can turn dry historical docs into narratives that seem almost novelistic. It's something he's done ever since his very first book, which was called Isaac Storm. I don't know if anyone's ever read it. It's this tick-tock or moment by moment of the days and hours leading up to the great Galveston hurricane of 1900, which I believe is still the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Anyway, if you haven't read that one, I highly recommend it. Anyway, back to this book. I read a recent interview with Larson, which was really interesting, in which he said he was deep into the research on the Demon of Unrest when January the 6th happened. And he said in an interview with the AP something like, I have to tell you, it was very strange, like seeing this happen on television, because all the documents I was reading seemed to be about the very same thing. And he gave this nugget, which I actually had no idea of, which was that Lincoln's primary concern had been about whether the electoral vote count would be disturbed. I kind of had no idea. So I do think this is the first Larson book which is going to say something about our current moment as well as one 150 years ago.
Tina, I think you're right. I think he operates squarely within the David Grann zone. The fact that there's not a David Grann book out this year means that the runway is clear for Erik Larson. Most people probably know him for one of his more famous books, which is The Devil in the White City, which is a book that goes into the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, but it also talks about the murderer, the serial killer, Dr. H.H. Holmes. Coincidentally, The Devil in the White City was a book that was meant to be adapted by Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio for years and years and years. Never happened. And then they ended up going with a David Grann book. So Erik Larson, you will have your day. Tina, have you read any other Larsons?
I've read all of them.
You've read all of them?
I've read all of them.
I love the one about the Lusitania.
I love that one too, but as I said, Isaac Storm is really my favorite.
Well, you're from Texas.
That's true. But I think if you go on his website, like he even says Isaac Storm is still his wife's favorite.
All right, we'll take it straight from the Larson's mouth.
Fine.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. Here with me are my fellow editors, Tina Jordan and Joumana Khatib, and we're talking books from the first quarter or so of 2024. Tina, you are here to talk about another new book from a longtime favorite. This is a writer who's been around for a while. You've read them all. Tana French, what's her new one?
It's called The Hunter, and it's set in the same universe as her last novel, which was called The Searcher. It's set in rural Western Ireland, where a retired Chicago cop has bought like an old rundown cottage, and he's been restoring it and fixing it up himself. It is not a Dublin Murder Squad novel, and I've already seen a little bit of disappointment online about this. People really love her Dublin Murder Squad books. They don't care for the ones that are not Dublin Murder Squad books, but I would frankly be surprised if she's ever going back. She has said in interviews, look, I want to move away from the Dublin Murder Squad. I don't want to write the same book over and over again. And For somebody who writes series mysteries, I think this is a really interesting thing to do because she has struck out in a completely different direction. And these books about the retired Chicago cop, his name is Cal, they're not the story of a murder and the subsequent investigation. They're not straightforward at all. They're completely character-driven. And it's about the people, and the murders they're not in the background, but they're not the focus of the story. And they're long. This new one is almost 500 pages long. And it just unfolds slowly. But it's the kind of reading I like the best, where you are somewhere else and you completely lose yourself.
Now, for those who want to dip into Tana French and have never really checked her out, you should go to nytimes.com, check out an article called The Essential Tana French, in which longtime critic Janet Maslin went through her oeuvre and picked out the ones that you should start with.
Right. My personal favorite is called Broken Harbor. And you don't need to read them in order because each one of the Dublin Murder Squad books is told usually from the perspective of a different person on the squad.
Let's dip now into a category that we call anticipated second novels. As you all know, second album syndrome, you never know if it's going to be good or if the debut is going to be the one that sort of holds them in people's esteem. But I actually am very optimistic about the two books that I am going to talk about. I'll start with Tommy Orange. His new book is called Wandering Stars. And his first book, hopefully listeners at least have heard of it. It was called They're There. It was incredibly well received. It was one of the Times' top 10 books of 2018. And it was about a group, about a dozen Native American characters who are all headed to a powwow in Oakland, California. That's where the author grew up. He's a member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. This new one is a sequel, or it's a sequel and a prequel, or maybe a sequel can be a sequel and a prequel. Part of the book takes place where they're left off, and part of the book goes back in time to sketch out the lives of some of the characters' ancestors. And so Tommy Orange really made a splash with his first book, and I think there are very high expectations for Wandering Stars. Another book that I'm looking forward to, book number 2 from this author, it's called Anita de Monte, Laughs Last. Author's name is Xochitl Gonzalez. Olga Dies Dreaming came out a couple years ago, and it was about a Nuyorican celebrity wedding planner. She's on the cusp of 40, and she finds herself in the midst of a bunch of family drama. Her brother is a congressman with some juicy secrets. She's not in a great romantic situation. Her mother vanished decades ago because her mother was a Puerto Rican revolutionary. She's someone who wanted to fight for independence from the United States. So even within a couple of those plot points, you can see how Gonzalez likes to knot together the personal and the political, and there's some of that in this new book. And it feels even more ambitious to me, just from what I've read about it. It's about an art history student. She's doing a research project on an older artist and his wife. His wife is also an artist. And the wife mysteriously, 15 years ago or so, fell out of a window. And there's mystery about it, but it's also a book that jumps back and forth in time, trying to deal with some of the stuff that Olga Dies Dreaming dealt with, about race, about class, about gender. But it also, the reason it feels more ambitious to me is because it throws these questions about art, artistic creation, artistic reception, who gets credit, who is elevated by galleries and critics and stuff like that in American culture. So Anita de Monte, Laughs Last by Xochitl Gonzalez, another second novel I'm looking forward to. So I feel like we have blazed through 8 books that the three of us are excited about, but there are many others coming out in the first quarter of this year. And so very quickly, I just want to do a little speed round of some other ones that either we're excited for or that we think will be big talkers. Joumana, let's start with you, a book called Splinters.
Yes, so this is Splinters by Leslie Jamison, who I think is one of our finest nonfiction writers and essayists working now. This is a book about her experience raising her daughter on her own. She went through a very difficult breakup with her former spouse, who is also a writer, got very ugly. It's touched on in the book, but the real focus is just how transformative and ferocious Jamison's love for her infant daughter is. And I found it very moving. She's incredible when she writes about the kind of altered state of motherhood. I highly recommend it.
We're recording this on Tuesday, January 16th, and if you have a subscription to The New Yorker, there's an excerpt from this memoir online this week. Tina, you have a short story collection that you want to give some love to.
I do. This is a collection called Neighbors and Other Stories, and it's by a woman named Diane Oliver, who was a young Black writer at the Iowa Writers Workshop when, just months away from graduating in 1966, she was killed in a car accident. And at that point, some of her stories had already, in fact, been published to great acclaim. But this is the first collection, all these decades later, of her work. And I think you're going to see a lot of stories about her, about the book itself.
One book that I would like to mention that I think we all are pretty sure will be a bestseller, no jinxes, is Funny Story by Emily Henry. You've probably seen her books at the front of bookstores, listeners. If you regularly go out to at least chain bookstores like Barnes & Noble, she's a bestseller, and she's been a bestseller with every book that she has published for the past 4 years. So there's 2020's Beach Read, 2021's People We Meet on Vacation, 2022's Book Lovers, and last year's Happy Place. Her new book is called Funny Story, and as is often the case, there's a man, there's a woman, opposites attract. It's a real Paula Abdul, DJ Scat Cat situation. So what's the question here? Will the stuffy children's librarian fall in love with let me see if I get this right, the ex of her ex-fiance's new fiance? What do we think is going to happen?
Well, I think that she'll teach him the Dewey Decimal System. Where do you file the ex of your ex-fiance's new fiance?
That is Funny Story by Emily Henry. Another book that I think people will be interested in coming out in the next couple of months is Table for Two. This is a short story collection by Amor Towles, former guest of the podcast. He is the author of Gentleman in Moscow, The Lincoln Highway. When he was on the podcast last year, he spoke briefly about this new book. 6 stories set in New York City around the year 2000, fairly contemporary for Towles, who has written a lot of fiction set in the past. There is one story in Table for Two set in Golden Age Hollywood, and it stars a character from his novel Rules of Civility. So he couldn't help himself. He had to fit one in there from way back when. Joumana, did you want to talk about another memoir?
Yeah, this is called Grief is for People by Sloane Crosley. Sloane, you might think of her more as a comedic writer. She's very antic on the page. She's very effervescent and light. And I mean, of course, she deals with substantive topics, but this felt like a real swerve in a lot of her work. So it's a memoir of losing, she calls him her best friend, to suicide. And it's really her way of grappling with this. And it opens actually with her house being robbed. She steps out for an hour. She comes back. There are muddy footprints on the comforter. Her jewelry's been taken. And so this is kind of like the overture to like a period of immense grief that's going to follow.
One memoir that I think is going to get a lot of news attention, at least, is by Christine Blasey Ford. It's called One Way Back. And Ford is the academic who, in 2018, accused then-Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He's now a United States Supreme Court Justice. She accused him of sexually assaulting her several decades prior when they were both high school students, I believe. You probably remember her very dramatic testimony. You probably remember his very dramatic testimony. And as I understand it, Blasey Ford, as many academics are, fairly quiet, fairly interior, fairly private, and having to be in the media glare this way really exploded her life. So it'll be interesting to get her reflections on that whole situation. Tina, do you have any memoirs coming in the next few months that you would like to mention?
I have just one, which is The House of Hidden Meanings by RuPaul. This memoir by the Drag Race producer and queer icon is easily the spring's buzziest celebrity memoir. I don't know anyone who's seen it yet, but there's a lot of hype.
Well, Tina, that's what we're here to do. Bring the hype. hype readers up about books that are coming out in the first quarter of the year. I hope we have done so. Tina, thank you as always for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Joumana, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Tina Jordan and Joumana Khatib about some books that we're looking forward to in the first quarter of 2024. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.